June 6, 1944, 5:30 hours. The cold waters of the English Channel slammed against the sides of dozens of American landing craft as they pushed toward the coast of Nazi-occupied France. The sky was gray. The wind was rising. The sea was turning hostile. And hidden inside the steel hulls of these boats was something no German soldier on the beaches had ever imagined they would face. They were not carrying infantry. They were not carrying artillery. They were carrying tanks designed to swim. They were called DD tanks. Duplex-drive Shermans fitted with canvas flotation screens and propellers that, in theory, would allow them to paddle the final miles to the beaches. It was one of the most daring, audacious, and desperate technological gambles of the entire Second World War. But as the shores of Normandy came into view, and the clouds lifted just enough for the silhouettes of German defensive positions to emerge, one thing became terrifyingly clear: the sea was far rougher than anyone had planned for. And within minutes, American tank crews would face a choice: obey orders and launch into the waves, or refuse and risk the entire invasion plan collapsing before it even began. And to understand why the United States Army was willing to risk amphibious tanks on D-Day, we must go back to 1943, to a meeting room inside the British War Office. There, a Scottish engineer named Nicholas Stroessler unveiled a radical idea: a collapsible canvas screen surrounding a Sherman tank, allowing it to float with the assistance of twin propellers connected to its engine. It sounded impossible, even absurd, but Allied planners were desperate. They knew that Hitler's Atlantic Wall was studded with 88mm guns, MG-42 nests, concrete bunkers, and interlocking kill zones. Infantry landing alone on the beach would be cut down by the hundreds. But tanks landing within the first minutes of the assault, could suppress those guns, provide cover, and carve pathways through obstacles. For the Americans, the need was especially critical at Utah Beach. The assault would be carried out by the 4th Infantry Division, supported by the 70th Tank Battalion, one of the oldest independent tank units in the U.S. Army. Their success depended on getting armor ashore almost immediately. Standing near them on the British coast in the days before the invasion were the tankers of the 741st Tank Battalion, assigned to Omaha Beach, where the German defenses were the most brutal along the entire Normandy coastline. These men had trained for months with the new DD tank system. They learned how to erect the canvas screen in minutes under fire, how to steer using propellers instead of tracks, how to maintain buoyancy even when waves came within inches of flooding over the top. But there was one thing no one could fully prepare them for: the weather of the English Channel. By early June, meteorologists warned Eisenhower that gale force winds were building. Small craft were already struggling. The seas were rising. DD tanks were only rated for calm waters with waves under 1 foot. On June 6, waves would reach 6 feet. But there was no time left. No alternative. No second chance. The invasion had to proceed. By 2:30 hours, the tank crews were awake, cold, and silent. Their landing craft, the steel-hulled LCTSAXS, rumbled beneath their feet. The smell of diesel mixed with sea spray. Officers walked between vehicles, checking the waterproof seals on the flotation screens. Inside one Sherman aboard LCT 598 was Sergeant Charles Jarvie, commander of a 5-man crew assigned to the 70th Tank Battalion. He had written in his small pocket notebook hours earlier: "If this thing floats, it's a miracle. If it doesn't, God help us." Across the channel, unseen in the pre-dawn darkness, German sentries at WN5, WN7, and WN9 bunkers scanned the horizon. They expected an invasion someday, but not this morning. Not in such weather. By 4:45, the American naval fleet opened fire. The sky thundered. The sea lit up in flashes. The Allied armada unleashed thousands of shells toward the shoreline. But for the tankers, this was their moment of decision. Utah Beach, 70th Tank Battalion. Their orders were clear. Launch 32 DD tanks at 6,000 yards offshore. Swim them onto Utah Beach ahead of the 1st Infantry waves. But the seas were violently unstable. Waves crashed over the bow of the craft. The flotation screens shook under pressure. Officers debated fiercely. Some crews protested. They had trained for calm waters, not this. Then the order came: launch. At 5:50, the first DD tanks of the 70th slid into the water. Their flotation skirts expanded. Propellers engaged. Against all expectations, they remained afloat. Slowly, almost painfully, they began their journey, 2 knots, barely making headway. The crews inside felt every wave slam into the canvas walls. Water seeped in through seams. Men bailed frantically with helmets. But they were moving. They were alive. And they were heading toward Fran. See, the situation here was far worse. Omaha's DD tanks were supposed to launch at 5,000 to 6,000 yards as well. But as the LCTs reached the release point, massive waves battered them. Some Shermans rocked so violently their flotation screens threatened to tear. Lieutenant Colonel John Upham, observing the conditions, begged the Navy to take the tanks closer before launching. He was overruled. Orders from above were absolute. The tanks must swim. At 6 o'clock, the ramps dropped and one by one the DD tanks rolled into the sea. At first, a few stayed afloat. Then the next wave hit. Canvas screens buckled. Propellers stalled. Water poured over the sides. Tank after tank sank in less than a minute, taking entire crews with them. Men inside struggled to escape the turrets, trapped by gear, ammunition, and rising water. Some made it out in time. Many did not. In less than 20 minutes, 27 of the 29 DD tanks assigned to Omaha Beach disappeared beneath the waves. What began as a bold technological gamble had turned into a catastrophe. But for the men approaching Utah Beach, none of this was yet known. They continued toward shore, blind to the tragedy unfolding miles away. By 6:15, the first DD tanks were now 1,200 yards from Utah. German artillery shells began landing nearby. Machine gun fire raked the water. Bullets tore through canvas screens, each one threatening to collapse the flotation system. Crewmen shouted over the engine noise. "Keep her straight. Keep her straight. Bail faster. Don't let the screen drop." At 400 yards, the water became shallower. The tank tracks made contact with the sandbar. The Shermans roared forward, screens collapsing as they transitioned to land mode. The tanks climbed out of the surf and onto French soil, wet, shaking but intact. By 6:30, 28 of the 32 tanks reached Utah Beach, an astonishing success under impossible conditions. Their arrival would change everything. But at Omaha, disaster still raged. Omaha Beach, easy red and dog green sectors, was becoming one of the deadliest landing zones of the entire war. With the DD tanks gone, the first waves of the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division ran directly into the teeth of German fire. Machine gun nests at Widerstandsnest 62 unleashed a storm of bullets across the surf. Men fell before they even reached the beach. Others drowned under the weight of their equipment. Artillery killed dozens in seconds. By 6:45, officers desperately radioed offshore. "Armor needed immediately. We cannot advance." The plan called for tanks to suppress the bunkers within minutes of landing. Without them, infantry were pinned behind shingle banks, unable to move more than a few yards. The German defenders, elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, saw the chaos and poured even more fire down the slopes. It was now that a second crisis unfolded. A handful of surviving DD tanks, just 2 machines, had somehow made it ashore after being released close to the beach by officers who violated original orders. These 2 tanks, commanded by Lieutenant Devereaux and Sergeant Raymond Himmelsbach, were now the only armored support available in the sector. They faced over a dozen MG-42 nests, anti-tank guns, and fortified bunkers alone. Meanwhile, infantry casualties mounted steadily. By 7:30, hundreds were either wounded, dead, or pinned in the surf zone. The sea behind them turned red. German officers observed the slaughter and believed victory was within reach. But what happened next would become legendary. The turning point at Omaha began not with tanks, but with a desperate act of improvisation. The skippers of several surviving LCTs, realizing that the DD tanks had sunk, made a bold decision. They would land the remaining Shermans directly onto the beach despite heavy fire. They knew it defied the plan. They knew the craft could be destroyed. But they also knew that without armor, Omaha would collapse. At 8 o'clock, LCT 600, 528, and several others gunned their engines and accelerated directly toward the shoreline. Shells splashed around them. One craft was hit and burst into flames. But the others pushed forward. The ramps dropped. Sherman tanks roared onto the sand, firing before their tracks were fully secured. Within minutes, 14 tanks were fighting their way up the beach. Among the first ashore was Sergeant Raymond Himmelsbach, whose tank had survived the initial swim. His crew fired round after round at a German strongpoint that had pinned hundreds of troops. Smoke and dust filled the air. Nearby, Lieutenant Devereaux's tank destroyed an 88mm gun that had been annihilating landing craft for over an hour. Infantry cheered as the Shermans blasted holes in the German defense. Yes. With armor now providing covering fire, the 1st Infantry Division pushed toward the crucial exit routes, the draws through the bluffs. At 8:35, Captain Joseph Dawson of the 16th Infantry Regiment led a charge through a gap created by tank fire. His men climbed the embankment, flanking German positions from behind. German resistance began to collapse. Machine gun nests went silent. Mortar pits were abandoned. The defenders, shocked that tanks were suddenly appearing on higher ground, began to withdraw. Meanwhile, at Utah Beach, the 70th Tank Battalion was already deep inland. Their tanks escorted infantry through the sand dunes, eliminated strongpoints, and reached the causeways leading toward the village of Pupaville. General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., landing with the first wave, famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." Tanks ensured that his words became reality. The secret of the swimming tanks. What made all of this possible was the little-known device that seemed almost laughable when first designed, the duplex drive flotation screen. The secret wasn't the canvas itself, but the system beneath it. A double-layered waterproof rubberized skirt. High-pressure air hoses keeping the frame rigid. A reinforced metal frame preventing collapse. Twin propellers linked to the tank's transmission. Emergency water pumps. Quick-release mechanisms for beach transition. It was clumsy. It was risky. It was experimental. But on Utah Beach, it changed the outcome of the invasion. And on Omaha Beach, even in disaster, the concept led to the tanks that finally broke the German lines. This was the moment the tide turned, literally and figurative. WWII 930, both Utah and Omaha were secured enough for reinforcements to land. Smoke drifted across the dunes. Wounded men were carried to makeshift aid posts. Destroyed equipment lay scattered across the sand. At Utah Beach, the success of the DD tanks had kept casualties remarkably low. The 4th Infantry Division suffered fewer than 200 killed and wounded in the first hours. The 70th Tank Battalion lost only 4 DD tanks. Omaha told a different story. The 741st Tank Battalion suffered catastrophic losses. Of the 29 DD tanks launched, 27 were lost, and many crewmen drowned inside their vehicles. The infantry paid an even higher price, with over 2,000 casualties in the first wave alone. But without the sacrifice of those Sherman crews, the ones who went down in the channel, and the ones who landed under direct fire, Omaha Beach might have been repelled entirely. Commanders who later reviewed the battle concluded that the arrival of those surviving tanks was the decisive element that enabled the infantry to break through. Several tank crewmen received commendations for their bravery. Silver Stars were awarded to crewmen of the 741st who stayed at their posts even as their tanks were sinking. Bronze Stars were given to multiple crews of the 70th Tank Battalion for their critical support at Utah. Posthumous awards recognized those who never escaped their steel coffins beneath the waves. The DD tank's overall performance in Normandy was controversial. Some called it a failure due to Omaha. Others called it a success due to Utah. But history has judged it more fairly. Under perfect conditions it worked. Under terrible conditions it still saved lives. And without it, the landings would have been far bloodier. The swimming tanks of D-Day remain one of the most daring armored experiments of the war, a strange mixture of innovation, desperation, bravery, and sacrifice. They represent the courage of crews who climbed inside machines not meant for the sea, and drove them into history. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Dark Tales as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.